Welcome to a quiet night of ghostly tales. As the world slows down, we'll drift through haunted places and restless spirits carried softly by stories meant to guide you into sleep. Do you believe ghosts are echoes of the past, or something still watching us now? Let me know your thoughts, and together, let's step into the whispers of the unknown. Tonight we begin with the oldest and most familiar sound of haunting. Not screams, not voices, but footsteps. A steady rhythm of weight pressing wood, of shoes on stone, of someone climbing or pacing where no one should be. They appear most often on staircases, the liminal spaces between floors, as if spirits too are caught wandering between worlds. Imagine the hush of an ancient English manor. Its staircases curve like the spine of the house, polished by generations of use. At night, when the family has long gone to bed, the halls are still. Then faintly, the creak of a tread. A second, then another. The slow, deliberate sound of someone climbing in the darkness. When lanterns are raised, the staircase is empty. Only silence waits. Such was the nightly torment of Borley Rectory, once called the most haunted house in England. Built in the 19th century and destroyed by fire decades later, Borley's legend lives on. Many visitors and researchers describe footsteps echoing on its main staircase, a sound so constant it became part of the house's identity. Witnesses said they could hear the measured pace of boots ascending, but no figure ever appeared. Even after Borley was reduced to ruins, locals swore that when the night was still, the phantom climb could still be heard, as if the spirit of the house itself refused to fade. Another case speaks of a grand courthouse in the American South, its steps made of stone, polished smooth by countless trials and hearings. At night, clerks finishing late work spoke of heavy footsteps climbing the central stairwell. The sound would begin at the base, travel slowly upward, and stop just short of the landing. No one ever reached the top. One woman said it was as though someone was forever making their way to judgment, climbing for eternity but never arriving. There is something unnerving about footsteps that never finish. The pause before the last stair is worse than if the sound vanished completely, because it feels like the presence is still there, waiting. Some claim they felt a rush of cold air at the moment the phantom step stopped, as though whoever was climbing had noticed them listening. Old houses across Europe tell the same story. Families wake in the quiet hours to hear the sound of pacing just beyond their doors, on the stairs, on the landing. Sometimes the steps are light, almost careful, like a child sneaking about in the night. Other times they are heavy, dragging, as if a tired soldier is climbing back home after a long march. Each version carries its own fear. In one small town, a family swore that every night, at exactly 2 a.m, someone ascended their wooden staircase. They would lie in bed, holding their breath as the boards groaned one by one. The sound reached the landing, paused, then faded. At first they thought it was burglars, but nothing was ever stolen. When they finally moved away, the new owners reported the same unsettling climb. Folklorists have suggested that staircases hold a symbolic role in hauntings. Stairs are not just architecture. They are transitions. They connect above and below, private and public, waking and dreaming. Perhaps for spirits, staircases are easier to inhabit because they are neither one place nor another. Just as a ghost is neither alive nor gone, footsteps on the stairs belong to no clear world. Even in modern buildings, footsteps echo where no one should be. An office tower in Chicago became infamous among its cleaning staff. At night, when the last of the day workers had left, janitors would hear shoes on the fire stairs. The sound was distinct. The hollow thud of leather soles, the weight of someone using the rails. But when the stairwell doors were open, the steps vanished. Security footage never showed a figure. One cleaner left her post entirely, saying she could handle flickering lights and Cold drafts, but not the sense of being followed up floor after floor by an invisible walker. The feeling of being pursued on stairs is deeply primal. Human instinct tells us the sound behind us means danger. To hear it and find no one there is to awaken an ancient fear. Some say that is why these hauntings linger so strongly in the imagination. They tap into something older than belief, older than reason, that urge to run when something unseen follows too close. One of the eeriest accounts of stairway hauntings comes from a Georgian townhouse in London. The residents reported that every evening, shortly after midnight, a slow ascent began from the cellar stairs. It would start faintly, as though far away, and then rise step by deliberate step until it reached the ground floor. The creaks would continue upward, and the family could follow the sound across 2 more floors until it stopped outside the top bedroom door. No knock ever followed. No whisper, no shadow, just the sense that something unseen had reached its destination and was waiting patiently outside. The family described a pattern that never broke. The footsteps always started at the same time, always moved with the same pace, and always ended in silence outside that door. A visiting priest once insisted he spend a night alone in that room. He claimed that when the footsteps stopped outside, the doorknob began to turn. He rushed forward, flung the door open, and found nothing. The hall was empty, yet the air was heavy with the smell of damp stone, as though someone had carried the underground cellar air all the way up. Another chilling tale comes from a small inn in rural Ireland. Its staircase built from thick oak beams. Guests staying in the second-floor rooms often complained of being awakened by the sound of someone stomping heavily up the stairs. When staff checked, they found the stairwell deserted. The innkeeper, an old woman who had inherited the building, told them the legend. The stairs were said to be haunted by a soldier who never returned from battle. His family had once lived there, and neighbors recalled the story of him coming home late at night, boots muddy, climbing those same stairs to greet his wife. He never came back alive, yet the sound of his climb continued long after. Locals came to believe it was his spirit keeping a promise to return. Staircases in historic theaters carry similar legends. Imagine an empty auditorium after the last curtain has fallen, only the stagehands and cleaners left behind. In one old playhouse, workers reported hearing someone rushing up the backstage stairs, the hurried patter of shoes moving quickly, as though late for an entrance. But when they searched, no actors stood ready in the wings. Performers grew so uneasy that some refused to rehearse after dark, claiming they could feel a presence passing them on the stairs, brushing the air with a sudden draft, but leaving no figure to see. Hospitals, too, hold their share of stair-bound phantoms. In an abandoned wing of a psychiatric hospital in Pennsylvania, investigators recorded the sound of measured footsteps descending an iron staircase. The steps grew louder as they came down, but stopped halfway, suspended in the middle as if someone had frozen mid-stride. The group described feeling watched from above, as though the unseen figure had paused to glare down at them. A shiver passed through the team, and though they waited, the footsteps never resumed. When they returned the next day, the recorder captured the same sound again at the exact same time. Stories like these reveal a strange consistency. The footsteps often repeat, as though trapped in a cycle, climbing or descending endlessly. Paranormal researchers call this a residual haunting, a playback of energy imprinted on a place. The theory suggests that stairs, with their constant use, absorb the weight and rhythm of countless people, storing that movement until, in some conditions, it replays itself. What begins as memory becomes sound, haunting anyone who dares to listen. Yet not every case feels like a simple loop. Some encounters carry intent, as though the unseen climber notices the living. One woman recalled growing up in a Victorian house in New England, where every winter night, footsteps would climb the back stairs. At first, she thought it was her father checking the windows. But when she grew older, she realized her father always used the main staircase, never the narrow service steps. One night, unable to resist her curiosity, she waited in the dark at the top landing. She heard the creak of each stair rising toward her. Then, just before reaching the top, the sound stopped. She whispered hello into the stillness. In reply, she swore she heard a faint exhale. A sigh carried up the shadows. The detail that chills most listeners about such stories is not just the sound itself, but the human quality within it. Footsteps are intimate. They are familiar. Unlike doors slamming or windows rattling, the sound of someone climbing stairs suggests presence. It suggests another body, another weight, another person walking in rhythm with you. And when no one is visible, the imagination fills that absence with figures both frightening and sorrowful. Perhaps that is why haunted staircases linger in folklore so strongly. They remind us of the line between above and below, past and present. They are places where we expect movement. So when the wrong kind of movement arrives, we cannot ignore it. Each creak of a step reminds us of those who climbed before, and perhaps of those who still climb unseen, long after their time has ended. Some of the most unsettling accounts of stairway hauntings come from places where many lives ended suddenly. In castles across Europe, staircases often wind like narrow towers, twisting upward in silence. Visitors sometimes hear armored boots clanging against stone, the echo of long-dead soldiers rushing upward to defend battlements. One such report comes from Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, where tourists claim to hear hurried footsteps in the spiral staircases of its oldest tower. The sound of heavy metal shoes reverberated around the stone, yet no figure followed them. Guards on duty admitted that they too heard these echoes, sometimes at dusk when the light dimmed, as if history itself was still running through the stairwell. Castles also tell of staircases marked by bloodshed. In one Welsh fortress, legend says a nobleman was slain on the stairs, his body dragged down step by step. Even today, visitors claim that if they wait quietly, they can hear the thud of a body being pulled down, a sound too deliberate to be explained away as shifting stones. Footsteps follow after, slow and steady, as though someone invisible is replaying the crime. Churches are not free of such phenomena either. In an abbey that has stood for centuries, monks recorded the sound of sandaled feet ascending the tower steps during their vigils. At first they believed it was a fellow brother coming late to prayer, but when they checked, they found the staircase empty. Some of the clergy whispered that it was the spirit of a monk who had died mid-service, forever hurrying to rejoin the choir he had left unfinished. The faithful claimed to feel a kind of reverence in those phantom steps, as if the sound was not a threat, but a reminder of devotion that had outlived the body. Not every story carries reverence, though. In one American boarding house, the staircase became the source of dread for every tenant. Residents heard pacing that began in the early hours of morning, a relentless back-and-forth march that shook the boards. The sound would ascend halfway up the steps, then retreat, over and over again. It was said to mirror the final hours of a restless man who had once lived there, wandering in torment before taking his own life. New occupants complained of sleepless nights, of lying awake listening to the restless climb that never ceased. Several left abruptly, unable to endure the footsteps that carried a weight of despair. Sometimes these stories find their way into family homes, passed down like heirlooms. In one farmhouse, generations told the tale of the midnight visitor. At exactly the same hour every few nights, someone unseen would climb the stairs to the second floor. The steps were heavy, dragging, as though the climber carried a burden. At the top, the sound stopped in the hallway, and the silence was broken only by the sound of breathing. Some children of the family swore they heard whispers in that pause, too soft to make out, yet undeniable. The footsteps never grew violent, never crossed into the bedrooms, but the knowledge that something reached the top each night haunted everyone who lived there. Investigators who studied these phenomena often remarked that the footsteps followed familiar patterns. The sounds tended to stick to the same staircases, the same pace, the same hours. It was as if the energy belonged not to a wandering ghost, but to the stairs themselves, repeating the imprint of someone long gone. Yet in other cases, the footsteps responded to the living. People who called out reported hearing the steps pause or even quicken, as though an invisible walker had noticed the intrusion. Those who dared to confront the sound often described an overwhelming chill, like an unseen gaze fixed upon them. Psychologists argue that the power of footsteps lies in how recognizable they are. A creak in the house can be ignored, a window rattle explained away. But footsteps are deeply personal. They belong to someone. To hear them without a source is to feel intruded upon, to sense presence in absence. That is why these hauntings persist in human memory. They are not vague disturbances, but intimate echoes of another being. And still, the accounts continue in modern homes and public places. Staircases, whether grand and sweeping or narrow and creaking, carry with them an eerie legacy. They connect spaces, yes, but perhaps they also connect times. Each step may be a trace of someone who passed long before, lingering in the boards or stones, waiting to be heard again. Or perhaps they are not memories at all, but the restless dead, still climbing, still searching for where they were meant to go. Perhaps one of the most unnerving qualities of haunted staircases is how they transform the familiar into something deeply strange. We take stairs for granted. They are practical, everyday structures, guiding us between floors without thought. But when those stairs begin to speak in footsteps, they remind us that the ordinary is not always what it seems. The sound of boots or shoes climbing in the dark carries with it an unshakable presence proof that the boundaries between living and dead, past and present, may be thinner than we think. One remarkable case comes from an old boarding house in New Orleans, a city steeped in ghost stories. Several guests staying in different rooms reported hearing footsteps ascending the central staircase late at night. The sound was heavy, deliberate, and always began in the same place, the bottom step nearest the front door. Guests described the sensation of something unseen pacing upward, step by step, until it reached their floor. Sometimes the sound stopped directly outside their door. Other times it continued up the stairs to vanish into the attic above. No staff ever found a source, and no other guests could confirm seeing anyone. The landlord, long accustomed to such stories, whispered that the house had once been a haven for weary travelers who never found rest. Perhaps, he said quietly, the footsteps were their eternal return. The notion of unfinished journeys is one that haunts many stairway stories. In a country manor in northern France, the sound of boots climbing the main staircase was recorded for decades. Visitors who stayed overnight often woke to find the sound beginning at precisely 3:17 a.m., lasting exactly 7 minutes before fading. The pattern that local researchers documented it as one of the most reliable cases of paranormal footsteps. Those who lived there spoke of a strange peace in hearing them, as if the sound belonged to someone fulfilling a promise they could never complete. Sometimes the footsteps are not slow and steady, but impatient, even urgent. In an old schoolhouse in New England, teachers reported hearing a sudden rush of steps climbing the back stairs just before dawn. The sound was so vivid, it seemed to vibrate in their bones. When they rushed to investigate, they found the stairwell empty, yet every floorboard along the route seemed freshly worn. This haunting left such an impression that staff began avoiding the building at those early hours. Over time, the story became part of the school's lore, whispered to new teachers as both warning and mystery. What makes these hauntings particularly haunting is their silence between steps. A creak is expected. A door slam has a clear cause, but footsteps without a source are a puzzle, a riddle whispered in wood and stone. They invite the mind to imagine the walker, who they were, why they climb, and why they never arrive. In many of these stories, there is no resolution. The stairs remain haunted because the journey is unfinished. Some folklorists suggest staircases themselves may store energy in a way other parts of a house cannot. They are places of transition, carrying weight up and down, bridging levels of life. That movement may linger, encoded in the very structure, and replay under certain conditions, much like an echo in stone. Yet in countless accounts, the footsteps are not random. They have purpose. They ascend with direction. They pause, they retreat, they respond. In these cases, the haunting feels less like a memory and more like a presence. Perhaps it is this sense of intent that lingers most in stairway hauntings. To stand in a silent hallway, hearing steps climb unseen, is to feel observed. The sound is intimate and impossible to ignore. It becomes a whisper of the past, a question left unanswered. Are these footsteps echoes of lives once lived, or are they the quiet march of those who never left? As we leave behind these haunted staircases for the moment, the memory of their sound may follow you. Every creak of a board, every soft tap in the distance becomes a question. And in the hush of night, perhaps the stairs themselves will answer, not with words, but with footsteps. When stairs speak, hallways listen. But sometimes, hallways begin to speak themselves. Empty corridors, silent for hours, can stir with sound. Footsteps echo faintly along the length, carrying an unfamiliar cadence, as if someone walks just beyond sight. These hauntings are common in places built for movement, schools, hospitals, hotels, but the experience is always unsettling. Hallways are thresholds. They lead somewhere, connect spaces, and when footsteps appear without a source, they turn those connections into mysteries. Unlike a staircase, which is defined by its vertical climb, a hallway stretches horizontally, endless in its reach. It invites the listener to follow, but there is nothing to follow into. One of the most persistent examples of hallway hauntings comes from a small hospital wing in the Midwest. Nurses working night shifts spoke of hearing someone walking the corridors. The steps were slow, deliberate, the sound of rubber soles brushing against worn linoleum. They would begin at one end of the hall, progress steadily, and stop outside a door before vanishing. No patient, no visitor, no staff member was ever there. Security cameras captured nothing. The sound remained a mystery, echoing quietly through the hall like a secret the building refused to share. In a boarding school in England, the story was different, but equally chilling. Students reported hearing footsteps pacing late at night along the corridor outside the dormitories. The sound was irregular, sometimes quickening, sometimes slowing, as though whoever walked was uncertain where to go. Several students said they would wake to the sound, hearts pounding, certain they had been called. But when they opened their doors, the hallway lay empty and still. Teachers who heard the same footsteps described them as belonging to a child, small and light, as if the corridor held the echo of generations who had once run along it. Such stories are not confined to sleeping hours. In an old hotel in Prague, guests reported hearing footsteps along the hallway outside their rooms at all hours of the day. The sound was most vivid in quiet moments, when the hum of the building faded, and the listener was left with only the slow march of unseen feet. Some described it as impatient, as though the walker sought something. Others said the sound was measured, almost ceremonial, like a guard walking a post he had kept for centuries. Staff said the footsteps would always stop outside one particular room, though it was said to be empty for years. Empty hallways have a way of carrying sound differently, shaping it into something strange. Hard floors and bare walls amplify even the faintest step. In a centuries-old monastery in Italy, monks reported hearing pacing in long corridors lined with stone. The footsteps would start softly, then grow louder, echoing off arches, until they seemed to surround the listener. At times, the monks said it felt as though the sound was coming toward them from all directions, a presence not confined to a single place. They would pray through the noise, but the footsteps continued until dawn. In many of these hauntings, the footsteps have a rhythm, a pattern that repeats night after night. That repetition gives the sound a life of its own. It becomes something more than an echo. It becomes a presence. In an abandoned schoolhouse in New England, investigators recorded the sound of pacing at precise intervals. The steps would begin at exactly 3 in the morning, walk the length of the corridor, then stop abruptly. Sometimes the sound returned hours later, following the same route. Witnesses described a strange chill that accompanied the footsteps, as though the corridor itself had grown colder with each pass. Hallways are strange places in themselves. They are neither destinations nor origins, but conduits. When footsteps appear within them without cause, they transform the corridor into something alive. They suggest the presence of someone or something moving in a space that should be still. Some investigators call it a form of intelligent haunting, a spirit choosing the hallway as its stage. Others believe it is a residual impression, an imprint of someone's passage so strong it repeats itself endlessly. But there are cases where footsteps in empty hallways seem to respond to those who hear them. In an old hospital in Japan, nurses working late shifts would hear pacing start when they entered certain corridors. The sound would stop as soon as they stopped moving and resume again when they continued. They described the effect as unnerving, as though the unseen walker was mirroring their movements. Some came to believe it was the spirit of a long-departed nurse, still making her rounds. Others feared it was something less benevolent, a watcher who used the sound to follow. The hallways that come alive are not always grand or ancient. Even in modern buildings, footsteps appear where they should not. In an office block in Chicago, cleaning crews reported hearing pacing in deserted corridors at night. The sound would follow them, sometimes closing in, sometimes fading away. One cleaner described the sensation as being watched through the soles of your feet. Security checks revealed no source, yet the sound remained consistent enough to terrify anyone working alone after hours. These hauntings remind us of how footsteps in a hallway can feel deeply personal. Unlike a door creak or a distant thud, they have direction, purpose, and presence. They invite a question: who is walking and where are they going? When the answer remains unknown, the sound becomes something more than a noise. It becomes a mystery, and the hallway becomes alive. There is something uniquely unsettling about footsteps in a hallway that comes alive because of the way they inhabit space. Unlike stairs, which move vertically, hallways stretch horizontally, drawing the sound along them as if guiding it somewhere unseen. They create an expectation. When footsteps begin there, the mind instinctively follows, searching for their source, even when none exists. One of the most famous cases comes from a hospital in upstate New York. Staff working the night shift described the sound of pacing in the long white corridors of an empty wing. The footsteps began softly, slow at first, then quickened until they echoed as though a whole person was moving just ahead. Nurses swore they could sense presence, a shadow brushing close to the walls. a warmth in the air followed by sudden chill. Security cameras showed nothing, yet those who heard the pacing said it was as vivid as the movement of flesh, not a trick of sound. Over time, the nurses began to avoid those corridors entirely, as if the footsteps had claimed them as a private domain. In an abandoned orphanage in France, the sound of pacing along hallways became a part of its haunting identity. Visitors exploring the ruins reported hearing steps that began at one end of the building and ended at the other. The sound always began in the same place near the old dining hall and always followed the same rhythm, slow, deliberate, steady. No living soul could be found. Some said the footsteps were the echoes of children walking the halls, the last traces of laughter and life before the building was abandoned. Others whispered that it was something older, the memory of grief left embedded in the stone. Hotels, too, have their share of stories. A historic inn in Edinburgh became notorious for the sound of footsteps along its upper corridors. Guests reported hearing them late at night, pacing just outside their door, then fading into silence. Some said the pacing moved from room to room, as if the walker was searching. Others described waking to footsteps that circled their own bed, stopping just outside the door before retreating down the hall. Guests often dismissed the first occurrence as imagination, but when it repeated night after night, the experience became too real to ignore. There is a particularly haunting account from an old railway station in rural England. Maintenance workers on the late-night shift spoke of footsteps pacing a deserted platform corridor. The steps were distinct, a heavy tread followed by a pause, then another. This pattern repeated without fail during their shifts. On one occasion, a worker followed the sound, expecting to find a late passenger or a stray traveler, only to find the corridor empty. Even the CCTV cameras failed to capture anything. The sound became so familiar to those who worked there that they began calling it the pacer, as though it had become part of the station itself. Empty hallways that come alive often feel as though they are inhabited by something ancient. Their silence is not absence, but a kind of waiting. In a centuries-old monastery in Spain, monks reported footsteps pacing the cloisters at night. The sound would begin softly in one corridor and travel steadily, echoing off stone walls until it stopped in the chapel. There was never a figure, never a shadow, just the sound itself, patient, deliberate, alive. Those who heard it spoke of a strange peace, as though the footsteps were part of a ritual that had been repeated for generations. But not all hallway hauntings carry a calm presence. In a derelict asylum in Pennsylvania, investigators recorded footsteps pacing the long corridors at irregular intervals. The sound was erratic, sometimes quick and sharp, other times dragging and slow. The investigators noted that the footsteps seemed to respond to their own movements, starting when they approached certain halls and stopping when they moved away. The unpredictability made the sound even more unnerving. It was not a simple echo. It was a presence that seemed aware. Hallways become something more than passageways when they come alive. They become stages for unseen actors, corridors for unfinished journeys, places where the sound of footsteps becomes a language, and that language carries meaning. It is a reminder that some spaces retain memory, that even in silence there can be motion. Footsteps in empty hallways are not just noises. They are conversations without voices, signals without form. They are a question and a warning. They tell us that somewhere beyond the reach of sight, someone is still walking. Some hallway hauntings become part of a place's identity, whispered about by those who work or live within them. They are not dismissed as mere coincidence. They become known, expected. In an old hotel in Vienna, staff spoke of a long, narrow hallway on the third floor where footsteps could always be heard after midnight. Guests who stayed along that corridor reported waking to the sound of pacing. It It was slow and steady, like someone walking in deliberate thought, moving back and forth without reason. Housekeeping staff refused to work the floor after dark, believing the sound to be the echo of someone who had died there, bound to walk forever. Such hauntings often appear where movement once was constant. In abandoned schools, hospitals, and prisons, hallways retain an echo of their former life. In a deserted wing of a psychiatric hospital in Oregon, the sound of pacing became a nightly occurrence. Investigators record the steps over several nights, noting a pattern. The sound always began near room 213, paced the length of the hallway, stopped at the far end, and then returned. The rhythm never changed. No matter how many times the building was emptied or searched, the footsteps returned exactly as before. For some who heard it, the sound was comforting, a strange reminder that even in silence, life persists. For others, it was deeply disturbing, a reminder that the dead may walk unseen. There is a haunting subtlety to footsteps in a hallway. They can be soft and fleeting, almost hesitant, or they can be bold and deliberate, cutting sharply through the stillness of night. In an old boarding school in Scotland, students spoke of footsteps that would begin softly at one end of a corridor and grow louder as they approached. Sometimes the pacing would stop abruptly as though the walker had noticed the listeners, then retreat step by step. Those who experienced it said it left a sensation of being observed, a feeling that someone unseen lingered just beyond sight. Even in modern buildings, hallway footsteps appear with chilling regularity. A business office in Chicago became known for its phantom pacing. Cleaners and night staff reported hearing footsteps echoing in empty corridors late at night. The sound would follow them, sometimes for minutes, only to vanish when they paused. The unnatural quality of the sound made it impossible to ignore. It was not the creak of settling boards or the hum of plumbing. It had weight, presence, and intention. Sometimes footsteps in hallways take on a life of their own. In an abandoned hotel in New Orleans, explorers reported pacing sounds that seemed to circle endlessly. The footsteps began faintly at one end of the hall, then grew louder as though approaching, only to retreat again into silence. The sound would repeat without pattern, neither ascending nor descending, simply circling. Those who stayed in the hotel overnight said the footsteps would sometimes stop right outside their doors, as though the walker wished to enter but could not. Empty hallways can also carry voices, whispers, or faint murmurs. In a historic monastery in Spain, monks reported hearing footsteps that were accompanied by quiet singing. The sound would begin in the long cloisters after midnight, pacing softly along the stone corridors before fading into silence. The monks spoke of the sound as a presence, not a ghost, something that carried intention. Others who have encountered hallway footsteps share similar feelings, that they are not random echoes, but purposeful movement. Some researchers believe footsteps in hallways are a form of communication. They suggest that spirits use sound because it is one of the easiest ways to make their presence known. Unlike objects, which require physical force to move, sound travels freely. Hallways become a kind of canvas, carrying footsteps as messages. Whether those messages are warnings, cries for attention, or memories replayed is impossible to know. The idea of footsteps as communication is deeply unsettling. A footstep carries intention. It is deliberate, personal. To hear one in a silent hallway is to hear the sound of someone moving towards something or away from something. And when there is no one there, the mind begins to search for meaning. The footsteps become more than sound. They become a mystery. Hallways that come alive teach us something important. They teach us that silence is never absolute. Even in emptiness, there can be motion, and in stillness, there can be sound. Footsteps in a hallway are not just echoes. They are voices without form. They are the heartbeat of the unseen walking among us. There is something quietly unsettling about footsteps that traverse empty hallways because they change the way we experience space. Hallways are meant to be pass-through places, unnoticed in daily life. Yet when footsteps appear without a source, the hallway itself becomes a stage. Every step takes on meaning. Every pause becomes intentional. And suddenly the corridor is no longer a silent passage, but a living place, pulsing with unseen motion. One of the most memorable cases comes from a deserted wing of an old hotel in Paris. Guests and staff alike reported hearing footsteps pacing late into the night. The sound would begin softly at the far end of the hallway and grow louder, as if someone were approaching. Then, inexplicably, the steps would retreat, fading into silence before reaching any door. Security cameras recorded nothing. Yet every guest who stayed along that hallway swore they heard the pacing, some claiming it became louder the longer they lay awake. For many, it became a nightly ritual of unease, the sound haunting them even after they had left. Schools hold a strange abundance of such hauntings. The wide, empty corridors between classrooms seem to magnify footsteps. In an old boarding school in northern England, students reported hearing pacing that began as soon as lights were turned off. The sound would travel along the hall with slow precision, stopping just outside dormitory doors. On occasion, the pacing would change pace, quickening before slowing again. Students claimed they could feel eyes watching them when the sound was closest, though they saw no one. Teachers who investigated said the phenomenon was too consistent to be coincidence. It became part of the school's lore, a whisper carried between generations of students. Even abandoned buildings hold the echo of footsteps. In an old asylum in Pennsylvania, investigators recorded what they described as a chorus of pacing. Long corridors seemed to carry multiple sets of footsteps, some slow, some fast, and weaving together like a silent symphony. The sound would begin at the far end, travel forward, and then stop abruptly. The lack of a visible source made the effect deeply unnerving. Witnesses spoke of an oppressive stillness in those corridors, as though the sound was the last movement of a place that had been emptied of life but not memory. Footsteps in empty hallways are sometimes accompanied by other sounds, whispers, soft thuds, even laughter. In one ancient monastery in Italy, monks reported hearing pacing followed by the faint sound of chanting. The steps would begin the shadowed corridors just before dawn, walking steadily until they reached the chapel. The footsteps stopped there, and the chanting faded into silence. For the monks, the experience was not one of fear, but of reverence. They came to believe that the sound was the echo of an unseen brother walking to prayer, a presence preserved in the stone and mortar of the building. There are hallways that seem to remember more than others. In a historic inn in Ireland, the third-floor corridor became infamous for footsteps that no one could explain. Guests who stayed in the rooms along that hallway reported waking to the sound of pacing just outside their doors. The sound would circle their rooms, sometimes stopping for minutes before moving on. Even those who did not hear it spoke of a strange unease while walking the corridor, a sensation that they were being watched. For the staff, the phenomenon became something they accepted, a haunting that had taken root in the inn's history. Some researchers propose that footsteps in hallways are a form of residual memory, a replay of sound imprinted into the building. Others suggest they are intentional, the act of a presence choosing to walk where it once did in life. Whatever the explanation, the effect remains the same. The sound of footsteps in a hallway unsettles because it carries a sense of purpose. It suggests movement, decision, existence. When there is no visible walker, the sense becomes even more potent. Hallways that come alive remind us of the strange intimacy of sound. Footsteps are personal. They carry rhythm, weight, and direction. They can be hurried or hesitant, heavy or light, but they always tell us something. The question is what? Are they echoes of lives long past, or the deliberate movement of something still here? As we step away from the story of these hallways, the sound of pacing lingers. It becomes part of the silence. It becomes part of the air. And perhaps, when you walk down a quiet corridor late at night, you may hear it too, a soft tread, a measured step, and the echo of someone who has not yet gone. There's a strange intimacy to footsteps in a home. They are not distant echoes or grand, hollow sounds. They are close. They are personal. They carry the sense of someone moving within your life, within your space. When those footsteps have no visible source, the effect becomes deeply unsettling. The home becomes something alive, something aware. Stories of footsteps in homes are countless. They happen in houses both ancient and modern, in places filled with generations of memories and in spaces freshly built. In each case, the sound carries an unnatural weight. The steps are not random. They move with intention, pacing, wandering, stopping at certain places, as if following a pattern only the walker understands. One of the most haunting cases comes from a century-old farmhouse in rural England. The family who lived there described the footsteps as part of their daily lives. They would hear them begin in the hallway late at night, soft at first, then growing heavier. The steps would cross from room to room, pause, and sometimes return, always in silence except for their tread. The most unsettling part was how they seemed to respond to presence. If a person got out of bed to investigate, the footsteps would quicken, as though aware of being watched. If the person stayed still, the sound would stop altogether, leaving the house wrapped in quiet. Another story comes from a small apartment in New York. The tenant, a young woman living alone, began hearing footsteps in the dead of night. They would start in her living room, pacing slowly, then move to her bedroom. She would awaken, convinced someone was there. But when she turned on the light, there was nothing. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the occurrences grew more frequent and distinct. Eventually, she began recording the sounds. Playback revealed slow, deliberate steps, each separated by a pause, as though the walker hesitated, thinking about where to go. The recordings became evidence that something unseen had taken residence in her home. Even in modern homes, footsteps without source persist. In a suburban house in Canada, a family began hearing footsteps on the stairs and in the hallway. At first, they thought it was the children or a creak from the old floors, but the sound was too consistent. The footsteps came at the same time every night, always starting in the living room and moving toward the bedrooms. They never stopped for long. Over time, the family noticed something stranger. The footsteps seemed to avoid certain rooms entirely. It was as if the walker knew exactly where to go and where not to go. Homes carry an intimacy that other places do not. They are places of safety, of warmth. When footsteps appear there without source, they breach that sense of safety. In an old Victorian home in Boston, the owners described hearing footsteps that would wander the hallway for hours. They were light steps, almost tentative, as if the walker was exploring. The sound would stop outside certain rooms, and in those moments, the air would grow inexplicably cold. The family began to speak of the walker as a presence in the house, a silent visitor who shared their living space. There are houses where footsteps are part of a cycle, appearing night after night without fail. In a small cottage in Ireland, footsteps began exactly at 2:17 a.m. every night. They started softly in the kitchen, moved through the hallway, and ascended the stairs to the bedroom. No one ever found an explanation. The family became convinced it was the ghost of the cottage's first inhabitant, a woman who had died there long before they arrived. She seemed to walk each night as part of a ritual, retracing a path frozen in time. In many cases, footsteps in homes feel responsive. People report that the sound will stop if they speak, as though the walker is listening. In an apartment in Japan, a tenant described hearing footsteps begin in her hallway every night. If she called out, they paused. If she stepped toward them, they quickened. The tenant came to believe she was living with something that was aware of her presence. For her, the footsteps became a strange form of communication, a silent interaction that could not be ignored. The patterns of these hauntings are as varied as the homes themselves. Some footsteps wander aimlessly, others follow strict repetition. Some appear once in a lifetime, others become a nightly ritual. What remains consistent is their intimacy. To hear footsteps in your own home is to feel the presence of another life, another being sharing your space. That is what makes them so haunting. They take something private and transform it into something unknown. The unseen walker in a home changes how we live within it. It turns familiar floors into thresholds of mystery. It turns silence into expectation. Every creak in the night becomes a question. Every footstep without source becomes a story waiting to be told. Some homes seem to carry footsteps as though they are part of their very foundation. They appear night after night, as though the walls themselves remember a presence long gone. In a centuries-old manor in Scotland, the family who lived there spoke of footsteps that began in the early hours of the morning. The sound would start softly in the hallway outside the master bedroom, then move toward the stairs, pausing at each step. Sometimes the pacing would circle the hallway for hours before fading away. The family spoke of the sound as a part of the house's rhythm, a haunting they could neither explain nor escape. In an apartment in London, footsteps became something more than a sound. They became a mystery that shaped the life of its tenant. The woman who lived there began hearing slow, deliberate footsteps late at night. They seemed to move with purpose, pacing from the living room into the hallway and then stopping outside her bedroom door. The steps would sometimes repeat several times in succession before disappearing. What unsettled her most was the way they seemed to change pace, depending on her movements. If she lay still, the steps would stop. If she moved toward them, they would quicken, as if the walker were aware she was listening. Over time, she began to speak of it as though it were a guest, invisible yet present, haunting her life quietly and persistently. Even newly built homes are not immune. In a modern townhouse in Chicago, a family began hearing footsteps in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. At first, they dismissed them as settling noises, but the sound grew more distinct. Slow, deliberate steps that began at the same time each night. The footsteps would travel the hallway, pause at the parents' bedroom door, and then retreat. No one ever saw the walker, but the family agreed they could feel its presence. They described the sensation as a weight in the air, as though someone invisible was leaning close enough to be felt but never seen. Sometimes the footsteps in a home seemed tied to memories. In a farmhouse in Kentucky, the owners reported hearing footsteps in the hallway that connected the living room to the bedrooms. The sound began softly, but with each passing night, it grew louder and more distinct. Eventually, they began to recognize the rhythm. It was the same as the steps of a child who had lived in the home decades earlier. They came to believe that the footsteps were a memory replayed, a lingering imprint of life once lived within these walls. To them, the sound was not frightening, but bittersweet, a reminder that the past never truly leaves. There are cases where footsteps in homes seem to carry a sense of purpose. In a Victorian home in Boston, the owners described hearing footsteps that would travel up and down the hallway late at night. The sound was deliberate, measured, almost as though the walker was counting steps. The pacing would stop outside the bedrooms and linger, leaving a silence that felt heavy with presence. They began to think of the footsteps as a visitor, someone moving through their home with a reason they could not understand. Footsteps can also appear as part of a pattern that repeats for years. In a small cottage in Ireland, the family reported hearing footsteps that began at exactly 2:17 a.m. every night. The sound started in the kitchen, paced the hallway, and then ascended the stairs. No matter the season or who was at home, the footsteps came without fail. For the family, it became a nightly part of life. They learned to live with it, accepting the sound as part of the house's nature. They spoke of it as though it were a quiet companion, a presence that belonged to their home. In some homes, footsteps seem to be aware of those who hear them. In an apartment in Tokyo, a tenant described hearing footsteps that began in the hallway outside her door. When she called out, they paused. When she moved toward them, they quickened. Over time, she came to believe she was sharing her home with an invisible walker who knew her movements. For her, the footsteps became a strange form of companionship, though it was one rooted in mystery and unease. The presence of footsteps in a home changes the way we live in it. Floors become thresholds, hallways become stages, and silence becomes filled with expectation. To hear footsteps without a source is to feel that you are not alone. It is to know that your home has become something more than shelter. It has become a place where the past and unseen can walk beside you. There is something deeply unsettling about footsteps in a home because they turn the most intimate of places into something unfamiliar. A home is meant to be a place of safety. It is where we retreat at the end of the day, where silence is a comfort. But footsteps in the quiet hours transform that silence into a question. They suggest presence without explanation, movement without reason. In a Victorian townhouse in London, a family spoke of footsteps that began softly in the hallway outside their bedrooms late at night. They would pace back and forth for hours, sometimes stopping just outside a bedroom door. The footsteps seemed purposeful, measured, as though the walker was fulfilling a silent routine. The family tried to capture the sound, but recordings failed to capture more than vague impressions. To them, the footsteps became part of their life, a nightly mystery they learned to live with, though it always carried a quiet unease. In a farmhouse in Maine, footsteps were not just heard, but felt. The family reported hearing slow, heavy steps pacing the hallway above their bedrooms. What unsettled them was the way the sound seemed to carry weight, as though someone was walking with intent. Several family members described a sensation of being watched when the footsteps came. The sound would stop abruptly, leaving the house in silence, so complete it felt unnatural. For them, it was less a haunting and more a presence, a silent companion that moved unseen through the home. Sometimes the footsteps appear as if they belong to someone trying to finish something left undone. In an old cottage in Ireland, the sound began nightly at exactly 2:17 a.m. It started in the kitchen, paced slowly through the hallway, and ascended the stairs. The family living there came to regard it as a ritual, a repeating journey of a presence bound to the home. They tried to ignore it, but over time they came to accept the sound as part of the house's identity. The footsteps became a part of their lives, as familiar as the ticking of a clock. In many homes, footsteps take on a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore. In an apartment in Chicago, the footsteps always began in the living room around midnight. They paced toward the bedrooms, paused outside of one door, and then retreated. No one ever saw the walker. No cameras revealed a source. Yet the sound persisted, night after night. The family began to speak of the footsteps as a resident of the home, something that belonged there without explanation. For them, it became less a haunting and more a quiet coexistence. There are places where footsteps seem to respond to presence. In a modern apartment in Japan, a tenant described hearing footsteps begin in the hallway outside her bedroom. If she remained still, they would stop. If she moved toward the sound, they would quicken. Over time, she began to speak of it as though it were a living presence, an unseen companion aware of her movements. For her, the footsteps became a strange, silent dialogue, one without words but full of meaning. The nature of footsteps in homes often makes them deeply personal hauntings. Unlike footsteps in public spaces or corridors, these sounds occur where life is private. They take place in rooms we know intimately. They walk across floors we know by memory. That makes their presence both familiar and alien. To hear footsteps in your own home is to feel a strange intrusion, a whisper of another life moving alongside your own. In a small cottage in Scotland, footsteps became so familiar that the family living there began to mark them in their own way. They kept notebooks recording when the sound appeared, its rhythm, and how long it lasted. Over the years, they noticed patterns. The footsteps were never heard during daylight. They always began in the hallway, and they always ended at the same spot near the old study door. The family came to believe they were listening to a memory etched into the house itself, footsteps of someone who had lived there long before them. Sometimes footsteps in homes are not just heard, but sensed. Several families speak of a presence accompanying the sound, a weight in the air, a shift in temperature, a feeling of eyes upon them. In an old Victorian home in Boston, footsteps would pace a hallway late at night, always stopping outside the master bedroom. Those who lived there spoke of a presence they could not see, but could feel something patient, deliberate, and endlessly walking. Footsteps in homes are not random noises. They are intimate, deliberate, and personal. They transform the ordinary into something deeply strange. To hear them is to know that your home has become something more than a shelter. It has become a space where the unseen walks beside you. Footsteps in a home are not merely sounds. They are movements that belong to someone who once was there or someone who still is, unseen. They carry the weight of intention. They possess a rhythm, a pace that feels deliberate. And when that rhythm enters your home, it changes everything. Silence becomes fragile. Every floorboard holds a question. Every hallway becomes a threshold. In an old farmhouse in Yorkshire, footsteps became a nightly presence, so familiar that the family could tell who they belonged to without ever seeing them. The sound began in the hallway outside the bedrooms and paced slowly toward the staircase. Sometimes it stopped as if to listen. Sometimes it turned, retraced its steps, and vanished. The family believed the footsteps were those of a man who had lived in the house long before them, a resident whose life ended quietly within its walls. They spoke of the sound with a mixture of fear and reverence, as though the walker were a memory that refused to fade. Even newly built homes are not immune. In a modern apartment block in Chicago, residents on the upper floors began reporting footsteps at night. They would start in one apartment, pace through the hallway, and stop at a door where no one lived. No camera ever recorded the walker. No explanation was found. Yet the sound persisted, nightly becoming part of the building's identity. Those who lived there began speaking of it as though the walker had chosen the building as its home. The footsteps became a silent presence woven into the lives of those who heard them. Footsteps in homes often carry a sense of repetition, as though the walker is bound to a single path. In an Irish cottage, the sound began every night at precisely 2:17 a.m. It started in the kitchen, paced the hallway, ascended the stair, and stopped at the top landing. For the family living there, the sound became a quiet fixture of their nights. They spoke of it with a mixture of resignation and awe, as if living with the footsteps was living with a piece of the cottage's soul. There are homes where footsteps seem aware of those who listen. In a small apartment in Tokyo, a tenant described the sound beginning softly outside her bedroom door. When she lay still, it stopped. When she moved toward it, it quickened. Over time, she began to speak of it as though it were a companion, an unseen walker who understood her presence. For her, the footsteps were not a haunting, but a strange dialogue, one without words, full of meaning. In other cases, footsteps in homes feel less like hauntings and more like echoes. In a Victorian home in Boston, footsteps would begin in the hallway late at night, pacing steadily, stopping briefly outside the bedroom doors. The family began to regard them as a form of memory, a recording of a life once lived. To them, the footsteps were not something to fear, but something to listen to. They became part of the history of their home, a quiet reminder that the walls around them carried the traces of those who came before. The intimacy of footsteps in the home makes them deeply unsettling. They transform the familiar into the unknown. Floors that have felt safe for years become stages for mystery. The quiet of night becomes fragile, broken by the sound of movement without source. Every step carries the weight of something unseen, something beyond explanation. Some believe footsteps in homes are imprint of memory, residual echoes bound to space. Others think they are signs of an intentional presence, a spirit that chooses to walk again. Whatever the cause, the sound changes the way we experience our homes. It turns silence into anticipation, stillness into something alive. A home with footsteps becomes a home that listens and responds. It becomes a place where the unseen walks beside you. In such a home, silence is never complete. Even when the world sleeps, the sound of pacing may continue, a quiet reminder that the walls remember, that footsteps, once taken, may never truly fade. There are places in the world where footsteps linger long after those who walked them have gone, travelers who never left. They haunt the corridors of abandoned stations, the halls of forsaken hotels, the platforms of forgotten railways. Their presence is felt most in the sound of pacing footsteps that come without form, footsteps that seem to belong to no one living, yet echo with the clarity of life. One of the most famous cases comes from an abandoned train station in rural England. The station had been closed for decades, its platforms crumbling, the rails rusting. Yet those who explored the station at night reported hearing footsteps pacing along the empty platform. They began softly, like a distant echo, then grew louder as though the walker was drawing closer. Some explorers described the sound as deliberate and even weary, like the footsteps of a traveler who had walked that corridor for years and never reached his destination. No camera captured the source. No one saw the walker. Yet the sound persisted, becoming a defining part of the station's legend. In an abandoned inn in the Scottish Highlands, footsteps became part of the building's presence. Guests who dared to stay overnight spoke of hearing pacing in the hallways, starting at one end of the inn and moving steadily to the other. The sound would repeat for hours as if the walker was following a route set long ago. Some claim they felt the walker's steps growing heavier as they approached certain rooms, lighter in others, as though the presence was guided by memory. The inn became known not for the beauty of its location, but for the footsteps that haunted it. There are places where footsteps follow the memory of movement itself. In an old railway tunnel in France, urban explorers reported pacing that seemed to travel the length of the corridor without beginning or end. The footsteps would start faintly, grow louder, pass through the explorers' positions, and fade again. It was as though someone was walking the tunnel eternally, a traveler who never reached the end of his journey. Those who heard it spoke of a strange intimacy in the sound, as if the footsteps were aware they were being heard and intended to be. Hotels carry their own share of such haunting. In a historic inn in Vienna, guests reported hearing footsteps pacing in the hallway late at night. The sound began softly near the stairs and moved with a measured rhythm to the end of the corridor, then returned. Some said the steps sounded deliberate, like those of someone making their way home. Others said it was the pacing of a soul lost in time, endlessly retracing its steps. The sound became part of the inn's character. For many visitors, it was not something to fear, but something to experience, a ghostly echo of journeys that could not end. Railway stations, hotels, abandoned tunnels, these are places built for movement. They carry with them the memory of footsteps. That memory is not always still. It can return, unbidden, in the quiet hours as if to remind us that movement never truly ceases. In a deserted train depot in the American Midwest, footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Maintenance crews working late reported the sound of pacing that moved in a precise rhythm. The footsteps began at one end of the depot, traveled steadily along its length, and stopped abruptly before beginning again. No one ever saw the walker. No explanation was ever found. Those who heard it began to speak of it as a traveler who had never left, bound to pace the depot until the end of time. There is a certain poetry in footsteps that never end. They speak of journeys unfinished, of roads that lead nowhere yet are still walked. In an abandoned hotel in Eastern Europe, guests reported pacing that began in the lobby, wound its way up staircases, and vanished in the upper corridors. The pattern repeated night after night. Those who stayed there began to speak of the walker as if it were part of the building itself, a silent traveler, whose footsteps had become woven into its walls. Footsteps of the unseen traveler are not simply noises. They are echoes of a life in motion, traces of presence in a place where time has stopped. To hear them is to step into a story without end, a journey that continues without a destination. The footsteps of travelers who never left carry a strange sense of purpose. They are not random creaks of an old building or the hum of settling stone. They have direction, rhythm, and weight. They belong to places built for movement, corridors, platforms, tunnels, and yet they move through them without destination. They are journeys without end. In an abandoned coastal hotel in Norway, footsteps became a nightly presence. The inn had been deserted for decades, its windows boarded and its halls filled with dust. Yet visitors who explored at night spoke of footsteps pacing along its corridors. They began softly in the distance, growing louder as though approaching. Then they would fade, as if the walker had turned away. The sound followed a pattern, a steady route, that always began at the lobby and ended at the grand staircase. No one ever saw the walker, and no explanation was found. For those who heard it, the footsteps became part of the hotel's soul, a silent traveler bound to wander forever. Railway stations seem especially prone to such hauntings. They are places of comings and goings where footsteps are the language of the living. In an abandoned station in Japan, explorers reported hearing pacing that began in the ticket hall and circled the platform. The footsteps were soft, deliberate, and continuous. They would stop suddenly, as though the walker had noticed the explorers, then begin again. The sound carried a strange intimacy, as though it was calling the listener into the story of its journey. There are tunnels that keep the memory of footsteps as though etched into their walls. In an old mining tunnel in Germany, the sound of pacing would begin deep inside the dark passage, moving steadily toward the entrance. Miners who once worked there told stories of hearing footsteps long after the mine had been closed. The sound was slow and patient, as though someone was walking that tunnel for the last time, over and over again. Visitors today still speak of the same experience, hearing pacing where no one walks. Hotels and inns carry footsteps differently. They are not part of a single route, but wander as if guided by a memory. In a historic hotel in Prague, guests reported footsteps pacing late at night. The sound began in the hallway near their rooms, moved past their doors, and disappeared. Some described the steps as hesitant, others as purposeful. For many, the sound became part of the experience of staying there. It was not something to fear, but something to listen to, a whisper of the lives that had passed through those halls before. Footsteps in abandoned places carry more than sound, they carry presence. They are traces of movement left behind, reminders that a place was once lived in, walked through, and cared for. In a deserted station in Italy, footsteps began every night at exactly the same time. They paced the platform for hours, stopping and starting without pattern. Those who heard it spoke of a walker bound to the station, a traveler who never left. The footsteps became part of the station's identity, a quiet proof that the dead may still walk among us. There is something deeply human about footsteps without a walker. They speak of journeys, of places we travel to and from. In abandoned spaces, they become echoes of what once was, a hotel, a station, a tunnel. These places were built for movement, for passage. When footsteps remain, they speak of movement that never ended, a traveler still pacing their chosen path. In a remote train depot in Russia, footsteps became part of its silent story. Maintenance workers spoke of the sound beginning at one end of the building and moving with deliberate pace to the other. It was steady, slow, and unmistakably human. Yet no one ever saw the walker. For those who heard it, the sound was a reminder that some journeys are never truly complete, and some travelers never truly leave. Footsteps are one of the most intimate traces we leave behind. They carry rhythm, presence, and memory. When they appear without source, they take on the weight of mystery. They become the sound of something that refuses to be forgotten. There is something deeply haunting about footsteps that repeat without end, as though belonging to travelers who have become bound to a single place. In the corridors of abandoned stations, in the halls of old hotels, in tunnels long forgotten, those footsteps become part of the space itself. They are not simply sounds. They are presence, memory, and motion intertwined. In an abandoned inn in the Scottish Highlands, footsteps became so consistent they were part of the building's identity. Guests who stayed overnight spoke of hearing pacing in the hallways, always starting at one end and walking steadily to the other. The rhythm of the steps was deliberate, almost like a pattern repeated nightly for years. Some who heard them described a sense of following an invisible guest, a walker who had never found their rest. For those who listened, the sound became a strange comfort, a reminder that the inn was alive with its own history. Railway stations are particularly susceptible to these echoes. They are places built for movement, places of arrival and departure. In an abandoned station in Japan, explorers reported pacing footsteps that circled platforms in the dead of night. The steps began softly, grew louder, then stopped, as though noticing someone listening. They carried an intimacy that unsettled the explorers, as though the walker was aware of being heard. There was no sight of a person, only sound, the sound of a traveler still walking, still returning to a place they once knew. Tunnels, too, hold this uncanny presence. In an old mining tunnel in Germany, footsteps could be heard pacing deep in the dark, long after the mine was closed. Those who spoke of it described the sound as slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking that passage endlessly. The pacing seemed to follow a pattern beginning deep inside and moving steadily toward the entrance before fading into silence. Visitors to the tunnel today tell the same story, a sound without source that clings to the air like a memory. Hotels carry footsteps differently. They do not always follow a single path, but wander as though guided by remembrance. In a historic hotel in Prague, guests spoke of footsteps pacing late at night. The sound would begin near their rooms, pass along the hallway, and vanish. Some described the walker as hesitant, others as certain. To many, the sound became part of the hotel's spirit, a reminder of travelers long gone but still moving through its halls. Footsteps in abandoned places are never random. They carry the weight of movement that belonged to someone. They carry presence. They are a kind of story told without words. In a deserted station in Italy, footsteps began precisely at the same time every night. They paced the length of the platform for hours, stopping and starting without reason. Those who heard it came to speak of the walker as someone bound to the station, unable to leave. The sound became part of the station's soul, a proof that journeys can continue long after the traveler is gone. There is a certain poetry to footsteps without a walker. They speak of journeys, of movement, of places we travel through. In abandoned spaces, they become memories in motion echoes of life that refuse to be silent. A hotel, a station, a tunnel, these places were built for footsteps, and when footsteps remain, they speak of travelers who never left. In a remote train depot in Russia, footsteps became an inevitable part of its story. Workers who stayed late reported the sound beginning at one end of the depot and moving steadily to the other. It was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Yet there was no sight of a walker. For those who heard it, the footsteps became proof of something unseen. They spoke of a journey without end, of travelers forever walking their chosen path. Footsteps are intimate. They carry the rhythm of life, the sound of presence. When they come without source, they become something more. They are whispers of journeys unfinished, reminders that movement never truly ends. To hear them is to step into a story without end, the story of the travelers who never left. The footsteps of travelers who never left are unlike any other haunting. They carry a peculiar quality, a sense of intention bound to repetition. They are not fleeting noises that vanish after a moment. They are rhythms. They are journeys replayed again and again, carried by the sound of movement without form. They remind us that some travelers do not arrive, that some paths are endless. In a deserted train station in the countryside of England, footsteps became a nightly ritual. Those who dared to explore spoke of the sound beginning softly near the platforms, pacing deliberately up and down the corridor. It was slow and measured, carrying with it a weight that felt almost human. The sound would come without warning, sometimes continuing for hours, only to vanish suddenly as though the walker had reached a destination we could not see. For the station, the footsteps became part of its soul, a silent traveler who refused to leave. Abandoned hotels and inns often hold the echoes of such footsteps as though they were etched into their very walls. In an inn high in the Scottish Highlands, guests reported pacing footsteps in the long, empty corridors. The sound would begin at one end of the hallway and travel steadily to the other. There was a regularity to it, a rhythm that seemed rehearsed. Some guests said the footsteps were filled with weariness, as if the walker had been pacing for years. Others said it was the sound of someone still searching for something lost. For those who listened, the footsteps became part of the inn's legend, an invisible guest who belonged there forever. Railway stations seem to be places where such footsteps linger most vividly. They are built for movement, for arrivals and departures. In an abandoned station in Japan, explorers spoke of footsteps pacing quietly along the platform in the dead of night. They began softly, almost shyly, then grew louder before fading away. Those who heard them described a strange intimacy, as though the walker was aware of being heard. No one saw the source, yet the sound was undeniable, a traveler still walking long after their train had departed. Tunnels, too, hold the presence of footsteps, as though carved into stone. In an old mining tunnel in Germany, workers reported hearing pacing deep within the darkness. Even after the mine had closed for decades, the sound persisted. The footsteps would begin faintly, growing heavier as they moved through the tunnel, then fading into silence. Those who heard it spoke of the walker as someone bound to a journey without end, pacing endlessly through shadow. Footsteps in abandoned places are not always terrifying. Sometimes they carry a quiet poetry. In a hotel in Prague, footsteps paced late at night, beginning near the rooms and moving along the hallway before fading. Some said the rhythm was hesitant, others certain. For many guests, the sound became part of their experience, a reminder of all the travelers who had once passed through those halls. It was an invisible echo of lives lived long ago. In an empty station in Italy, footsteps began each night without fail. They paced the length of the platform, stopped, and began again. No one could explain them. The sound became part of the station's identity, a presence that no lock or closing could silence. To those who heard it, the footsteps were proof that journeys never truly end, that travelers never truly leave. There is something profoundly human about footsteps without a walker. They speak of movement, memory, and existence. They are echoes of lives that once were, carried on a path that never ends. To hear them is to feel the weight of presence without form, to step into a story without a conclusion. Footsteps in abandoned places are more than sounds. They are memories in motion. They are proof that time does not erase every trace, that some journeys continue long after their travelers have vanished. In those places, footsteps are not just echoes. They are voices, the voices of the travelers who never left. The footsteps of the unseen have been recorded in stories for centuries, whispered in quiet homes, told in the corridors of abandoned buildings, and passed down as part of local legend. But what lies behind these phantom steps? Are they echoes of the past, restless spirits, or something far stranger? Tonight we explore the theories that try to explain one of the most haunting mysteries, footsteps without a walker. One of the oldest explanations comes from folklore itself. Across cultures, footsteps are often linked to spirits. In Japanese tradition, there is the idea of eerie, lingering spirits who have unfinished business. Footsteps in abandoned places, according to this belief, are the echoes of spirits still walking towards something unresolved. They are the imprint of presence left in the physical world, a sound that remains when the soul cannot rest. This idea is echoed in Scottish and Irish folklore, where footsteps in old homes and castles are said to belong to the spirits of those who died within their walls. They pace endlessly, searching, waiting, retracing journeys that ended abruptly. From a psychological perspective, there is another explanation. The human mind is remarkably sensitive to sound, especially in silence. In the quiet hours of the night, our perception sharpens. The mind begins to interpret even the faintest noises as something more. Footsteps might be the sound of settling floors, pipes shifting, or distant echoes carried through walls. Yet in haunted locations, these explanations do not fully satisfy those who experience them. The sound of footsteps in a home, a hotel, or an abandoned station often has a clarity and intention that feels impossible to explain purely through physics. Some parapsychologists argue that phantom footsteps are a form of residual hauntings. These are not hauntings in the traditional sense, but recordings of past events embedded in a place. Just as a photograph captures a moment in time, some buildings might hold impressions of movement. These footsteps are not ghosts moving in real time, but echoes of movement that replay when conditions are right certain hours of the night. Particular shifts in temperature, or in places heavy with memory. Such footsteps are not interactive. They follow a pattern as though bound to repeat the same steps over and over. Others look to the idea of intelligent hauntings, where the footsteps are not merely echoes, but conscious presences. These hauntings suggest an unseen entity that is aware of its surroundings. In this theory, footsteps that change pace when approached, that stop when observed, or that seem to respond to the living, are evidence of an intelligence behind the sound. This brings the mystery closer to the stories of the travelers who never left footsteps that are purposeful, that follow routes, and that behave as if aware of an audience. There is also the idea of interdimensional phenomena. Some theorists suggest that phantom footsteps could be the result of overlaps between dimensions. In this view, footsteps are the sound of movement from another plane of existence, bleeding through into ours. This theory explains why the source of footsteps can be impossible to locate, why they appear in certain places with histories of unusual activity, and why they are sometimes experienced in clusters of paranormal events. Footsteps in abandoned stations, old homes, or tunnels could be places where the veil between worlds is thin, allowing these sounds to slip through. From a scientific angle, some researchers investigate acoustic anomalies. Certain architectural features can amplify or carry sounds in strange ways. Long corridors, staircases, and tunnels often create echoes that can mimic the pace of footsteps. Temperature changes, wind patterns, and structural shifts can also create noises that sound startlingly human. Yet there are countless documented cases where such explanations fail, where footsteps have been recorded with no visible cause, where no environmental factor could account for their timing, clarity, or persistence. Then there is the idea of collective memory. Some psychologists and paranormal researchers propose that certain locations carry the memories of events so intense they become embedded in the structure of the place itself. Footsteps, in this sense, are echoes of those memories, replaying like a faint soundtrack of the past. This could explain why footsteps appear so often in places heavy with history, old mansions, ancient castles, deserted hotels. The building itself becomes a vessel for memory, and the footsteps are the sound of that memory being lived again. Whatever the cause, footsteps without a walker stir something deep in us. They are one of the most human of sounds, yet when they come without source, they become deeply uncanny. They speak of movement without destination, presence without form. They are whispers in the dark that refuse to fade. Some researchers look to physics for answers, suggesting that phantom footsteps may be connected to vibrations carried through surfaces. Old buildings are often full of hidden conduits for sound. Floors creak, beams settle, and air moves in ways that can mimic the rhythm of a human step. In certain conditions, even distant noises can be carried and magnified in ways the ear interprets as footsteps. However, this theory cannot explain all cases, particularly those where footsteps have been heard in places with no one present for miles. Nor does it account for footsteps that appear to follow a pattern or react to observers. Parapsychologists studying haunted locations have developed classifications for these noises. One type is the echoed presence footsteps that occur as part of a residual haunting, playing again and again like a recording. Another is interactive footsteps, where the sound seems aware of those listening, altering its pace or stopping completely. Then there are spatial footsteps, heard only in specific areas at certain times, suggesting a connection to the structure itself. Each of these types carries its own mysteries and defies easy explanation. Historical records are full of accounts of footsteps that cannot be explained by natural causes. In the archives of old estates and castles, there are diaries and testimonies describing pacing that began at midnight, stopped outside specific rooms, and vanished as though the walker had turned away. These reports span centuries and cultures, appearing in stories from Scotland, Japan, Russia, and America. The consistency of such accounts suggests that phantom footsteps are not bound to one tradition or explanation, but exist as a universal mystery. Some theorists turn to quantum physics for answers. They suggest that what we hear as footsteps could be vibrations from another reality, overlapping with ours. According to this view, certain locations act as weak points between dimensions. Footsteps, then, might be traces of movement in another world, slipping through the barrier. This would explain why footsteps can appear without cause, why they seem purposeful yet vanish without trace, and why they often occur in places already rich with strange occurrences. There is also the possibility that footsteps are a form of communication. In some cultures, footsteps are thought to be messages left by spirits. These sounds are not random, but intentional, a way for the unseen to make themselves known. In this sense, footsteps could be the simplest form of contact movement that carries meaning even if we cannot decipher it. They are a language without words, audible proof of presence. Psychologists exploring the phenomenon suggest that footsteps may also be tied to the human need to find patterns. Our brains are wired to recognize rhythm and movement, even where there is none. In silence, the mind can interpret creaks and echoes as footsteps because footsteps are one of the most familiar human sounds. But this explanation does not account for the cases where footsteps have been recorded in controlled conditions, or where multiple witnesses report the same sound at the same time. Another possibility lies in memory and emotion. Places carry energy, and that energy may manifest as sound. In locations with a deep history of tragedy, loss, or change, footsteps could be the sound of memory itself. They might be echoes of human movement bound to a place, replaying again and again when certain conditions are met. This would explain why footsteps are so often reported in historic buildings, abandoned stations, and old homes, places heavy with human history. No matter the theory, phantom footsteps remain one of the most unsettling mysteries of the unseen world. They are sound without source, movement without form. They make us question what it means to walk, to be present, to leave a mark behind. They remind us that not all journeys end, and not all footsteps fade. Footsteps without walkers are more than unexplained noises. They are an enigma that bridges history, psychology, folklore, and science. They are proof that some mysteries cannot be confined to a single explanation. They are proof that some journeys continue long after the traveler is gone. Footsteps are uniquely human sounds. They carry rhythm, intention, and presence. To hear them without seeing the walker is to be faced with a mystery that touches both the rational mind and the imagination. That is why phantom footsteps have drawn fascination for centuries, inspiring theories that range from folklore to cutting-edge science. In old houses, footsteps are often described as belonging to specific individuals, a long-dead resident retracing their last steps, a servant still bound to the corridors of their home, a traveler forever pacing an empty platform. These descriptions align with the concept of residual hauntings, where the footsteps are not a living presence, but a playback of events etched into a location. The steps have a rhythm and purpose that repeat like a memory caught in the fabric of the building itself. In castles and manor houses across Europe, such footsteps are woven into their histories. Accounts from centuries past tell of footsteps beginning at the same time each night, pacing corridors without deviation. Witnesses describe a distinct pattern, the sound of boots on stone, the creak of stairs, the slow dragging of steps. These accounts are remarkably consistent across time and place, suggesting that the phenomenon is not merely imagination, but something woven into the nature of the experience. Some researchers propose that footsteps without source may be a form of psychophysical imprint, a blending of human consciousness and environment. According to this idea, intense emotional energy can leave a lasting mark on a space. That mark can manifest as sound footsteps, voices, or even music, replayed when the conditions are right. This could explain why footsteps are often heard in places tied to deep emotion: abandoned hospitals, old homes, and historic stations. The walker, in this sense, is not a ghost in the traditional way, but a remnant of a powerful moment in time. Another theory comes from the field of parapsychology. Footsteps could be a form of spirit communication. Spirits, according to this view, use footsteps as a subtle means of contact. Unlike loud poltergeist activity, footsteps are quiet and deliberate. They invite attention without confrontation. They are whispers of presence rather than direct voices, a way for the unseen to make their existence known without disturbing the living too violently. In this way, footsteps become a language of movement rather than words. Some physicists and paranormal researchers take the theory further. They suggest that footsteps may originate from dimensions beyond our own. In certain locations, the veil between worlds might be thin. This could allow sounds, movements, and impressions from another reality to slip into ours. Footsteps, then, could be travelers crossing boundaries we cannot see. This theory could explain why footsteps are sometimes heard in clusters of paranormal activity, why they can be recorded with no visible cause, and why they often appear in places steeped in mystery. There is also the question of the observer. Some theories suggest that footsteps may exist only in the presence of those who hear them. They could be part of a shared perceptual experience, something created by the mind's sensitivity to sound and suggestion in certain environments. This would explain why footsteps are often reported in solitude or silence, in moments when the listener's mind is most alert. Yet this cannot explain the many cases where multiple witnesses hear the exact same footsteps at the same time. Cultural interpretations also shape how footsteps are understood. In Japan, they are often seen as eerie, lingering spirits bound to unfinished business. In Scotland, footsteps in castles and houses are linked to tragic histories: soldiers who died defending their homes, or servants who fell in service. In the American South, footsteps are sometimes called the echo of the past, a sound that reminds those who hear it that history is alive. Across cultures, footsteps without a walker become something more than sound. They become a sign, a story, a presence. Whatever the truth, footsteps without a walker remain one of the most compelling mysteries of the unseen. They bridge science and superstition, memory and presence, the physical and the inexplicable. They remind us that the world is not always what it seems. They ask us to listen, to wonder, and to question what lies beyond sight and sound. Footsteps are movement. They are a sign that someone or something has been there. And when the walker cannot be found, those footsteps become the purest form of mystery. Theories alone, however, cannot capture the feeling of standing in silence when footsteps break it. They cannot explain the shiver that passes through the air when the sound is close, deliberate, undeniably human, and yet unseen. That is why phantom footsteps remain more than a question of science or folklore. They are an experience, a reminder of something beyond explanation. Some who have lived with the phenomenon speak of footsteps not as a fear, but as a presence. In old homes, they describe the sound as part of life itself, a quiet pacing that comes with the night, like a heartbeat embedded in the house. In abandoned stations or forgotten tunnels, footsteps become part of the place's identity, an echo that belongs to the walls. For these witnesses, the footsteps are not a threat. They are proof that a presence remains, walking quietly where we cannot follow. One of the most chilling possibilities is that footsteps are signs of a deeper reality, one we cannot fully perceive. If footsteps can appear without source, if they can follow patterns and respond to observers, then perhaps they hint at a dimension of existence beyond our senses. Perhaps footsteps are traces of something moving just out of reach, a presence that is not bound by the limits of time or space. This idea moves beyond ghost stories into something both unsettling and beautiful. The possibility that movement itself can outlast a life, that some journeys never truly end. Some scientists studying the phenomenon speak of psychic footprints. They suggest that human thought, emotion, and memory can leave traces in the physical world. In certain conditions, these traces could manifest as sound. Footsteps would then be a form of living memory, carried forward by the environment itself. In this way, footsteps are not the result of a walker, but of memory walking a sound born not of flesh, but of remembrance. Footsteps in haunted places often resist explanation, precisely because they belong to more than one realm. They are physical in their sound, yet intangible in their source. They belong to the living world and something beyond it. They carry history, intention, and mystery. They walk a line between the natural and the supernatural. For believers in the paranormal, footsteps are proof that some part of us endures. They are the lingering echo of those who came before, a sign that presence outlives flesh. For skeptics, they are a challenge, a call to explain something that cannot be dismissed. For those who have heard them in the quiet of night, footsteps are something both ordinary and extraordinary. They are part of the world we live in, and part of the world we cannot see. Footsteps without walkers leave us with more questions than answers. They remind us that silence is never absolute. They remind us that stillness can be broken by movement we cannot explain. They remind us that the world holds more than what meets the eye. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the theories. Perhaps footsteps are the voice of memory, the echo of life, the trace of something beyond. They could be the proof that the past still walks among us, that some journeys do not end, that some travelers never truly leave. When you hear footsteps with no one there, you are hearing more than sound. You are hearing mystery. You are hearing movement without form. You are hearing a question that has no answer. And maybe that is why phantom footsteps endure in our stories. They are the sound of the unseen, the pace of the unknown. They walk through our homes, our dreams, and our fears. They remind us that there is still something left to explore, that there are places where the veil is thin, that there are travelers who never left. So when silence falls and you hear a footstep in the dark, remember this: footsteps without walkers are not simply noises. They are a reminder that the world still holds its secrets. They are proof that movement, once begun, may never truly end. Welcome to the mystery of the phantom footsteps.